Hello and welcome back. I'm Sarah Liz, and today we're going to make 3 cards. We're going to stretch some dies. We're going to play with some fun techniques. We're going to make that card using the 3D embossing folder of the month. I don't have the small die of the month, but I think that is beautiful. These pomegranate cards, you guys. I can't believe I made those. Did you know there's a better press of the month now from Spellbinders? I also have a video that just came out with this quick and easy card kit. The Spellbinders clubs are amazing and an incredible deal. If I had to pick this month, I'd get the Die Hard Club. It's free shipping. You get 10% off the rest of your Spellbinders orders, and they're always amazing. This die set, the pomegranates, it's the large die of the month, and it's a little different. You can kind of see I'm layering up some inside pieces over some outside pieces. Some of these you have to cut a couple of times, okay? But it's totally worth it. Spellbinders sent me this die set and I wasn't sure. It's been a crazy month and I was like, you know what? I will just make a card and post it to my Instagram. We won't make a video. It's gonna be okay. We'll let it go. I happened to turn my camera on because I had some issues with some footage a couple of videos ago and I was trying to work that out. I am so glad I did. I am in love with these cards. I hope you like them too. This is a little bit time consuming, but I love die cutting because I love the texture. I love the impact and the wow factor that you get from it. And I just think these cards are so different and they turned out more beautiful than I could have expected. Sometimes I surprise myself, right? Okay, so what I did, I took this large sort of branchy piece and I cut 2 of them. I layered it up with my wet glue, and then some of the leaves have a second piece that you can layer on there. So I cut that out of a lighter green and I'm layering it on top of those leaves. You could skip that and I don't think it would matter, right? When I work with a die like this though, my mindset is always, if you're gonna go through that work, do it right. Right? Like do it all out. I decided to do some ink blending. You could skip this too. In the intro video for this, which is also the photo that is posted on the Spellbinders page, I'll link all the club kits and things below. The card that Yana made, she didn't do any ink blending and it is gorgeous, right? So you don't have to. But again, I'm trying to be brave too. When I go into my card making anymore, I'm like, try something new. Do an extra something, see how it goes. That's where these cards were. I didn't think I was going to keep this footage. I didn't think I was going to make a video out of it. So I wasn't worried about the simplest version possible or an easy to teach version of it. I used some picked raspberry on the red pieces. It's just red cardstock. And then I cut the florals out of a cream. It's a very, very pale cream. And I thought that worked out really well. There's not an even number of spaces, right? So if you cut out all the little pomegranates and all the little florals, you're going to have an empty spot or two where it's asking for a larger something. So I cut one of the flowers twice. These little pomegranates, there are some little white pieces that look like pomegranate seeds, and maybe that's what they're supposed to be. But I stuck them on the back where the holes are to sort of fill that in. But you could just stick like a circle of cardstock or something like that if you prefer. In the middles of these, there are 2 more pieces that layer on there, and I just assembly line, right? I sort of line everything up. I put glue on all of them. I pick them up with my pickup stick. Start to finish, these probably took me 15 minutes and I made 2. So I'm not going to make you watch the second one. I did a few things differently and I will point that out. But yeah, we're only going to watch it once. And then there's these little bitty florals that have a tiny little piece that goes in the middle they just add a little extra something. They sort of fill in that whole branchy business. This is what is so clever about these dies. Okay, so I have the large pomegranate and I'm going to add a little ink blending there. But then there's smaller pieces. It's like a cut open pomegranate. We see this a lot in like citrus dies. Well, you cut that twice. The one I ink blended has fewer holes and smaller holes. Up above, it has identical pieces with more holes and they're larger. And so it just creates this absolutely incredible texture. I think next time I make this, I'm going to play around with glossy accents on that middle layer because I want it to look like a wet fruit. I don't know why I didn't do it this time. I thought about it. I think I just didn't want to wait for it to dry, which is almost always the reason I don't do something in my craft room. That or it's a mess. Okay. And so this cream piece, same cream I used for my florals, one of the dyes you run through with the outline impresses into it and shows you exactly where these sort of cut pieces of the inside of the fruit go. Okay, so here's the larger one with the holes and it's layering over the top. On the second one, instead of ink blending that first layer of red, I just cut it from a darker color of cardstock, right? Like a blackberry colored cardstock. And I don't know which one I like better. You'll have to let me know in the comments below. So I'm layering those up. I found these pieces were big enough that I could just use my fingers, but you know, if you don't have that dexterity or you don't like to do that, just grab some of those reverse tweezers. I think that would be easier for me. I just forget to do it all the time. Okay, so here's our branch and you can see these little green circles and that's where you're supposed to put these larger die cuts. And the two at the bottom are the largest, so that's where you put the largest pieces, the two pomegranates. And they overlap a little bit, so I put just a little bit of glue kind of behind the one on top. So they'll stick together and that's going to make it easier when I go to add it to my card. Then I'm adding my florals. I'm paying attention to where the stems are. So the stem extends out through the bottom of the flower, or like you can see the fruit, the small fruits that are hanging, there's a larger end. And so I think in my head, I was like, well, the largest part would be closest to the stem where it's getting food and nutrients and that kind of thing. So I have them kind of hanging out from the branch so that the largest part is touching the branch. Then I'm picking random spots where I felt like there was a lot of green and I am adding in my little white flowers. This might have been easier after it was added to the card. You can see some of these I'm adding to really skinny parts of the branch. Also, my pickup tool kind of sucks. so I had a little bit of a hard time there, but we got it done. We handled it. I'm going to set that aside. And then I have an A2 piece of gray cardstock. And I want to show you the whole blending process, but I don't want you to have to sit through the whole thing. So here I sped it way, way up. I just love watching this come together, even as I'm doing it or watching somebody else do it. This is Iris ink from Simon Says Stamp. It's the darkest purple in this set, which is a challenge. So for me, the goal is to use a really large blending tool, or I guess the process is to use that really large blending tool and go over it with lots of layers and a light hand. Also, the ink matters. Look how that dried back. It was a little splotchy when we finished it, but it's perfect here. The Simon Says Stamp inks and the Altenew inks are my go-to for this kind of ink blending. I don't know what magic is in there, but it turns out beautifully, even if I didn't do a perfect job. We're also covering up a fair bit of that with our pomegranate. This just barely fits on my A2 card. There are some pieces to add to the bottoms of the pomegranates, but I didn't feel like they fit, so I didn't add them here. Also, I forgot. I might have tried to see if there was a way that they did. This Thanks die is also in that set, but I felt like it needed to pop a little bit, so I cut it out of the gray and then used the same ink over the top to highlight the thanks. And then I cut a black rectangle that is very slightly larger, and I'm just going to layer that back behind it. It fits beautifully right kind of in the middle of all of that, but there's so much texture on the card. I'm going to use these 1mm black foam mini squares from Spellbinders, and I'm going to add those to the back just to help it lay better kind of in the middle of all of that. This card uses the die as it was designed, right? And that's always where I start. If I have a die set that does something like this, let's make what I'm supposed to make with it. But I always want my cards or the dies and supplies that I purchase to be able to do more for me. So that's why I started the second card. I was like, you know what? This is really beautiful, right? Here's our finished card. I love how this turned out. Totally worth it, even though, I mean, there's a lot of pieces. The large die of the month is always huge. I love that. But this one is what sold me. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made that. So I made all of this off camera, and back there you can see that slightly darker cardstock. I've added the pieces at the bottom out of some gold mirror cardstock, and then I also used gold mirror cardstock in the middle of the florals that are already on our branch. Then we're ink blending again. Here I have my Altenew ink. This is Teal Cave. And we're going to make a mini slimline card. So this panel is 3.5 by 6.25, and I'm doing the same thing I did last time, speeding it way up for you. So I just kind of a light hand and lots of layers, and I'm pulling up from the bottom and fading out through the middle. I wasn't sure what I was doing here. This is my be brave, try to make another one, try to do something different. And I'm trying to figure out how this is going to fit. I know the two pomegranates are kind of the star of the show. And so I'm figuring out where they need to go. And then I'm trimming off a couple of the leaves. I could have left them. I'm not entirely sure that needed to happen, but it cleaned it up a little bit. Those leaves were hanging like half on, half off the panel. And it's making it easier for me to visualize what pieces are going to go on the card and what pieces are left, because I kind of want to keep them intact. So I'm flipping it over, and actually I glued something I shouldn't, so I kind of wiped the glue off. But I'm going to glue down just the pomegranates and a couple of the flowers, one of the small fruits, but I'm keeping everything on that large stem to get started. It's going to help me with placement and stability. Glue your pomegranates together, right? Otherwise, they're just hanging there, and the wiggle is a challenge. Okay, so I'm laying that onto the card, and I'm going to press that down. I'm finding places where things weren't glued together like I thought they were. Not a big deal, okay? But now I have these pieces hanging off the top, and I want to remove as much of that intact as we can. So instead of cutting through that white flower on the top left, I'm taking the whole piece off. I want a couple of clusters. To me, it's easier to start filling in gaps with pieces that are already together, right? So here I'm just kind of like moving it around the edge of the card, and it fits perfectly on that right top. I was like, whoa, that's meant to be. It left a spot that was obviously for my sentiment. Then this piece I'm wiggling around, I edited a bunch of that out. It moved a lot of places before it ended up here. But just kind of move things around the edge of your card. What I ended up with here was everything kind of hanging down from that branch like it would have been on the original. I found that that looked the most natural. But I also want pieces hanging off the edge. I feel like that extends the scene and makes the card feel bigger than it is. I'm going to add this whole panel onto my card base because I'm cutting it off the edges with my scissors, and I didn't want to do it with my trimmer. My scissors actually are a little stronger, but I want a thicker edge. I get a cleaner cut that way, right? So this little piece of greenery is no big deal. That's a quick snip. But here, there's a lot of layers on that flower. So that's why I wanted it on the card base first. If I'd have gone to my really big trimmer, it could have handled it. I have these little white flowers, and I'm placing them around to see where I want them. And I end up not putting them on the clusters. You'll have to let me know what you think. I'm going to put them somewhere else. But I left that in just so you could see it. I don't know. I like where they ended up, but I also like where they were the first time. I love where the card is right now so much. I didn't want the sentiment to overwhelm or take away from that. So I just grabbed my mini Everyday Glimmer sentiments, and this one says happy birthday, right? It's not fancy. It doesn't need to be. I'm gonna run that through my hot foil machine, and you can see there's the little happy birthday, and there are some dies in that set. If you're new to hot foiling, or if you just don't have that set, it's awesome. There's 3 little dies that will cut out your strips at different sizes. And then in the end, there's enough on the end hanging off there before the flags that I was like, let's trim that down a little bit. So I'm going to bring in my trimmer, and I just use that finger guard that's on the far right, and I line up the edge of my letter with where the finger guard ends. And then I keep trimming until they're even, because sometimes I get it right the first time and sometimes I don't. I have another strip of red cardstock that I'm going to layer behind there. You wouldn't have to, but there's so much dimension on this card. When you think about that cut open pomegranate, right? We have that sort of cream cardstock, and then we have the blackberry cardstock, and then the red cardstock, and it's kind of layered on top of the other pomegranate. I just felt like the sentiment needed to have some of that dimension too. And this to me is easier than adding little foam squares, because I hate taking the backs off of them. I don't know. What is it in your craft room where you're like, you know what? This is a thing I do all the time, but I hate it. It's the backs of anything adhesive. So I ended up putting these little white flowers just kind of hanging out in midair around my sentiment. And I like that little pop of white there as well. Then I'll glue my sentiment down, and we'll make sure that it's straight. And that finishes up this card. We are stretching this die into something entirely new. It's a different shape of a card. I love this card. I hope you like it too. Next, they also sent me the 3D embossing folder of the month. I love embossing. It's so simple and it has such an impact. But I was like, again, be brave, try something new. I'd been ink blending, so I was like, well, let's start by ink blending a huge panel. Okay, so this is half a sheet of cardstock. It's pale pink cardstock. It's 65 pound, because we're going to add some paste to it as well. And I started with a really pale ink and then moved into hydrangea, which is a slightly darker version of the same ink. This one is Aqualicious, and I'm trying to get like a third of this cardstock in each color. We're going to do blue and purple and pink. This is a pretty forgiving technique. When you add a paste over the top, it kind of mutes the ink blending. Again, I wanted to show you all of it, but I'm speeding it way up for you so you're not stuck watching it forever. Ultimately, I knew I kind of wanted the piece from the middle, and I figured, well, let's blend a bigger piece because I'm going to muck up something. And that way I can just pick the best part. I'm going to regret some of that later. So this is solar paste. I have only had this for a little while, and it's maybe the second time I've used it. This is Cross My Heart, and it is see-through. So we're going to see that ink blending behind it, but we're also adding a wet medium on top of a water reactive ink. And so it smooths out some of that blending. The paste has like some mica in it. So it's adding a sheen, like a pale pink sheen to all of this. And you can see it here. I used my heat gun to dry it, but that was so thin. I just used like a foam blender. It's so thin, it would have dried in about 10 minutes, but I'm impatient. Once it's dry, I'm going to add a little bit of water with a baby wipe to the back of it. And these embossing folders are massive. I am embossing a 5.5 by 8 inch panel of cardstock. And when I take this out, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I'd paid more attention to the edges. Actually, the ink blending looks great, but I didn't take the paste all the way out. There are pieces along the edges where I'm like, that one isn't shiny. I should have just cut this in half, right? So there I am kind of looking at the two halves going, should I just make 2 cards? I wish I had. The other reason I didn't is because it shrinks up just a little when you run it through the machine, because that embossing is so deep and beautiful. So I saved you the pain of watching me cut away edges from this. I took the piece out of the middle. I did. I saved the rest of it. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but something, right? So this is that same Glimmer set, the mini everyday sentiments. And this one says sending birthday wishes. I wanted something a little larger than just happy birthday. And I can always use another birthday card in my stash. I've added my panel onto just a top folding A2 card base, and then I ran my Glimmer sentiment through my machine, and I will use the dies that come in the set to cut that out. In the end, I'm looking at it in editing, and I kind of like just that purple on the card, just like that. But in my head, I was like, it doesn't stand out enough. You'll have to let me know. Should I have just added it to the card base on the purple? I probably would have stacked it up just so it's sturdier. But instead, it's a 1/4 inch when it comes out of the die. And I'm adding a slightly larger dark gray behind that. And then I'm going to add a slightly larger matte silver behind that. I don't know. I feel like maybe it didn't need that many. I did, as I was making it, I edited out so many versions where I peeled the sentiment off of a backing. In the end, I like it, but what would you have done? Where would you have quit with this sentiment? Or would you have stacked this all the way up? I'm adding some of those thin foam squares. They're 1mm foam squares from Spellbinders and a little bit of glue, so I have wiggle room. There's so much dimension that I find my sentiment lays better if I either stack up a couple extra layers of cardstock behind it, or if I put a little bit of foam behind it. And then that way it's just sort of filling in, especially with the foam, the gaps where it's a little bit uneven. And it's really simple, sending birthday wishes. These are the 3 cards we made. We made the die as it was intended, and then we stretched it into a mini slimline card. And then finally, we used that 3D embossing folder. I will link the large die of the month, the 3D embossing folder, and all of the clubs below. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.